So I've got to address the Christian roots of freedom, but the story of freedom in modern Western culture is often associated with the decisive break with the past effected by the French Revolution. A new vision of liberty, fraternity, equality was substituted for the oppression identified with the Christian tradition. The revolution sought to replace religion by politics as the real source of human liberation. And it was a shift which reflected the belief that evil is the consequence of society and not of original sin. In this reading of the roots of modern concepts of freedom, the conventional view is that very little happened between the death of Marcus Aurelius and the birth of Voltaire. And there is some truth in this story of discontinuity. But many of the ideas which inform modern notions of freedom, ideas that are seen to be self-evident, are undeniably a secularized version of the Judaeo Christian inheritance. The New Testament sets a very high value on freedom. There is abundant evidence that the biblical narrative continues to inspire struggles for liberation. Jesus Christ himself exhibited a remarkable degree of freedom from conventions. He was a religious teacher, but neither an academic nor an ascetic. He had no settled home, paid little special attention to his blood family, ate with all and sundry, was unusually open to children and women, and even those of dubious reputation, and even Samaritans. Now, notoriously, some versions of Christianity have been highly controlling and coercive. And even from time to time, the distance between the Christ-like ideal and ecclesiastical practice has prompted agitation for reform. Nothing ought to obscure repeated Christian failures. But for Christians, as John Zizioulas writes, Christ is the whole reality of human beings, but he does not force himself upon us. He appears among us as someone we can reject or accept as we like. So the movement inaugurated by Jesus Christ and first known as the Way was a challenge to ancient notions of theocratic absolutism. Under the pharaohs, the Inca, the emperor of China, or even under Caesar, the order of society was conceived to be part of the divine order. But in St. Matthew's Gospel, Jesus is shown a coin bearing the likeness of the Emperor Tiberius and the inscription, Son of the Divine Augustus. And in his response, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's, Jesus opens up a space for the secular life of the citizen, together with the need for constant renegotiation between the claims of a particular state or social custom and the service of the eternal God. And the early Christian community, which sprang out of Christ's self-sacrifice, was a new kind of social organism. It was not just a federation of study groups looking at the teachings of Jesus Christ. There were many such groups in the Roman Empire, living without any threat of persecution. Instead, the Christians chose to call their community an ecclesia, the word used of the sovereign body of a Greek city-state, summoned by authority and composed of adult, male, freeborn citizens. By contrast, the Christian ecclesia from the beginning included slaves, women, and children. Membership of the new community involved a freedom from existing social and political norms, which proved to be very disruptive. And it became clear that religious freedom for the Christian ecclesia was not just a private matter, but one which required civic autonomy. I just couldn't understand at one stage in my life, why did the Romans persecute the early Christians? After all, it's just about going around saying, be nice to one another. I just couldn't understand what was the temptation to persecute such innocent people. It was a new kind of social order. At the end of his famous I Have a Dream speech delivered from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963, Martin Luther King quotes from the words of St. Paul, "There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male or female, for all of us are one in Jesus Christ." And that was a universalizing of the vision of human dignity and freedom which permeates the Hebrew Scriptures. According to the book of Genesis, and this text reverberates through the history of discussions on freedom, God created human beings in his own image and likeness. It's the source of the now secularized conviction that all human beings have an innate dignity and enjoy various rights. And man in Genesis enjoys a certain freedom even in relation to God. God makes the animals, but then presents them to Adam to give them names which God accepts. And it's perhaps significant that in the Quran, it is God who teaches man the names of the animals. In our day, the appeal to human dignity is frequently made as if it were a self-evident truth, even when other parts of the biblical revelation have been abandoned. Nietzsche was perhaps more rigorously consistent in arguing that man in himself, the absolute man, possesses neither dignity nor rights nor duties. It is culture and art that create beauty and lives which then come to possess dignity. Nietzsche's view of human worth and dignity is inegalitarian and achieved rather than innate. And in consequence, he thought that the ethics of compassion associated with a biblical view of humanity would disappear with the death of God. God acts in history, according to the Hebrew Scriptures, as a liberator of the oppressed. There's constant reference to the experience of bondage, which leads on, interestingly, to prescriptions about how Israelite behavior towards foreigners should be a kind of attitude and response which reflects their own experience of bondage. Biblical liberty is not only to be enjoyed by a privileged caste, but it's to be shared. In the New Testament, the death of Jesus Christ is a new exodus, a passage to freedom. And freedom was liberation from captivity to a life enslaved to cravings, desires, the lust of power, which cause the individual to turn in upon himself. It was a freedom for life as persons, enabled to embrace a right relationship with their neighbor, with the beyond all, with God. So freedom from captivity was the precondition for profound relationship with the other, in which we find our true and deepest humanity. As a new kind of social order and as strangers and aliens, the Christian church experienced persecution at the hands of the state, and at first Christians were taught merely to endure, but eventually they were led to articulate the case for religious freedom. And in the writings of the 2nd century Latin theologian Tertullian, we find the phrase religious freedom coined for the first time. There is much to say about Tertullian, but you cannot bear it now. But his teaching was not forgotten, and substantial quotations from Tertullian, written out in Thomas Jefferson's own hand, appear in an annotation to the relevant section on religious freedom in his 1782 Notes on the State of Virginia. So crucial to the development of civic freedom in the West was the collapse in the 5th century of the institutions of imperial government. And so the church had an opportunity to assert its own freedom, and this set up a tension between the two authorities of church and state, which strongly influenced the medieval debate on freedom and rights. Medieval society was saturated with a concern for rights. The common gloss on Gratian's Decretum laid down that no one is to be deprived of his right except for very grave cause. The problem is, of course, to determine when the doctrine of natural rights, inhering in all individuals, emerged from the medieval concern with the rights of particular persons and groups. And I think that William of Ockham in the 14th century is a particularly significant source of teaching about the freedom, the temporal rights and liberties of human beings conceded to the faithful by God and nature, which not even the Pope could overrule. Thomas More appealed to independent Christian conscience as the basis for his refusal to swear the oath required by Henry VIII when he claimed supreme headship of the Church in England. And More's example brings us to the fragmentation of the old Western Latin Church in the 16th century. With an eye informed by all that's happened in the intervening centuries, we are presented really with an ecumenical agenda for repentance as we reflect on the aftermath of the French Revolution, and especially on the 20th century rise of the messianic secular states in Germany and Russia. It's clear that one of the unintended consequences of the wars of religion was a disenchantment with the foundational place of the Judaeo Christian tradition in the culture of the West. But it's also fair to say that in the turmoil of the Reformation era, there were new Bible-based assertions of liberty, and Calvin in his Institutes echoes Luther's call for Christian liberty, liberty of the individual conscience from Catholic canon law and clerical control, liberty of political officials from ecclesiastical power and privilege, liberty of the local clergy from central papal rule. And this particular tradition has its echoes very much, of course, in the United States, in the career of people like William Penn, who in a letter to Lord Arlington, written, it might be said, from the Tower of London, Penn said, "Force may make hypocrites, but it can make no converts." But of course, the problem arose very sharply in this period of freedom, meaning freedom from constraint, must have liberty, must have limits. And even the revolutionary poet John Milton, in the chaos of the middle 17th century, with the religious fanaticism and the social conflict of the time, was moved to declare that liberty hath a sharp and double edge, fit only to be handled by just and virtuous men. So the 20th century saw the defeat, who can say for how long, of race-centered fascism and class-centered communism. And now there are different challenges, and in this fresh context, we're called to restate the vision of human freedom. The world seems to have been reimagined as little more than a global marketplace, committed to a project of growth without limit, with no end in view beyond the process itself. How can imaginations and desires shaped by advertising and economic imperatives be free to find delight and fulfillment in non-material relationships? It's taken the passing of several generations to bring to light the soulless implications of the dominance of a form of radical positivism that recognizes the empirical number-based sciences as the only valid form of knowledge in the public square. There are constant invocations to human dignity, the rights of the individual, But the reality seems to be that for each of us, we are increasingly subject to a seemingly irreversible extension of process and impersonal systematization, which leaves the deracinated individual with no place to stand, from which a critique and resistance might be possible. Some, of course, see this as a hopeful development. Silicon Valley's Kevin Kelly sees technology as growing into something self-aware and independent of its human creators, which he calls the Technium. And as our systems become so large and our technologies so complex, it seems harder and harder to steer them in our chosen direction or to make them respond to human needs in our schools and hospitals. The cry, "Take back control," is often simplistically directed at some institution or person, but it reflects our unease at the gathering strength of an inhuman force that seems to be in some inexplicable way independent of us, yet is at the same time acting in us. As Jacques Ellul asks, what does freedom mean in an age of continually improved means to carelessly examined ends? And there, with perhaps a few seconds to go, I draw my remarks to conclusion.
A few seconds. Lord Chartres, I have a question. You dealt with the conflict between the earthly and divine powers, but there's also a conflict between God's all might and man's free will. How free did the early Christians believe that they were?
Well, they believed that actually relating themselves to a figure who represents the whole of human being in his self-sacrifice, in his love of the other, that was the discovery of freedom. They didn't believe that a life actually dominated by cravings and desires was a free life. That was real slavery. Unfortunately, one of the shortcomings was they were better able to discern the slavery of impulses and desires and cravings, and not so capable of seeing the sin of slavery itself, which I think is over to Spartacus.